So we have this moment where Stella and Mitch seem sort of fated to be together. I think there's a sort of a structural irony in this, in that actually I think there's a at least as powerful sense of fatalism about um, Blanche and Stanley's interactions, but actually here that fatalism is on the back burner, I think, because there's a sense of connection between Blanche and Mitch. And Stella says, Blanche, this is Harold Mitchell, my sister Blanche Dubois. And I think just this formal use of naming signifies the difference in linguistic register between the girls and the men, and the boys, sorry, the ladies and the men. And Mitch says, with awkward courtesy, obviously, sort of class difference is palpable, I think, in this stage direction. How do you do, Miss Dubois? And then, he feigns this sort of sense of gentility that Blanche is supposedly looking for. And Stella says, how's your mother, Mitch? And I think there's a clear contrast with the men and their lack of interest in his family. And we see that she's obviously sent over that custard. There's obviously a sense of consideration that's going on here that's not typical of the way the men interact. Crosses slowly back into the kitchen, glancing back at Blanche and coughing a little shyly. Obviously, he's kind of fixated by her. He realises he still has the towel in his hands, and with an embarrassed laugh, hands it to Stella. Blanche looks after him with a certain interest. I think that there's a sense of mutual reaction in each of these kind of key moments, and that I think it's by virtue of their vulnerability, the fact that he has obviously been chivalrous in this opening line, and has then been considerate as well. I think contrasts with the way that Stanley interacts with each other, and I think it also contrasts with Lulu and Stan's interaction in a birthday party. Blanche says that one seems superior to the others, and of course the word superior is extremely ironic here, because it does invoke that sense of snobbery and superiority that Blanche is constantly drawing attention to in these opening scenes, but also I think has an irony here as a sort of misapplied lexical choice, because Mitch is I'd say in the subordinate position in the sort of masculine hierarchy that these characters seem to formulate with each other. And Stella says, yes, he is. She is aware of that. I think of Blanche's meaning. She's aware of his sort of superiority in terms of emotional intelligence and empathy. His mother is sick. Is he married? No. Is he a wolf? So we see this kind of, again, this connection between the men and animals, and it exposes her feelings of vulnerability and her lack of trust and judgment, this lack of trust in her position. I don't think he would be. What does he do? So there's I think a sense of accommodating her snobbery. And she then, in following this, unbuttons her blouse, and there's a sign of comfort, but actually I think a sign of perhaps growing sort of sexual confidence we might add in here. There's a growing sense of sexual confidence in her unbuttoning of the blouse. He's on the precision bent in the spare parts department at the plant Stanley travels for, so he's a manual labour. And she says, is that something much? She has no idea about how to relate to this reality of blue-collar guys, basically, of labouring workers. It gives us this sense of distance and doesn't even, I think, can't even grasp the language of the position. So a sense of social class is incredibly distant here. And he says, no, Stanley's the only one of his crowd that's likely to get anywhere. And I think through his domineering personality, we see how important that is. So there's a sort of contrast, I think, here with Stanley in a birthday party. This one is on track for some kind of material success, and Stanley in a birthday party actively evades that sense of social commitment and commitment to community and consumerism. Grant says, what makes you think Stanley will? Look at him. I've looked at him, that you should know. His strength and dominance is sort of unsubtle in both senses. There's nothing hidden going on here. I'm sorry, but I haven't noticed the stamp of genius even on Stanley's forehead, and of course there's a misapprehension here, because genius is not what is required in this shifting economic and political reality. She takes off the blouse and stands in a Pilksink brassiere and white skirt in the light through the portiere. The game has continued in undertones. So there's a sort of fragility of her defences against the violence of reality. And I think a sense of her sexual inclinations. She's just met this man and is immediately stripping off. And of course, there is a sort of, it's the natural thing to do at this time of night, but I don't think it's coincidental that there's a sort of a sense of sexual compulsion about her behaviour in these lines, that she is again on that streetcar named Desire. She's being driven by it. Stella said it isn't on his forehead and it isn't genius. She's completely aware of this. And Blanche says, oh, well, what is it and where? I'd like to know. It's a drive that he has. You're standing in the light, Blanche. There's a conflict of ideologies and visions of success and values in their dialogue here. Stella is aware of what Stanley's strengths are and his adaptability, his rugged materialism, his sense of determination. She knows that that's what's going to be key to success in this second half of the 20th century. It's a drive that he has a singular focus on material success, and that does become in many ways the thing that we associate most with the American dream in the 20th century. And she says, you're standing in the light, Blanche. There's this sense of Blanche's own vulnerability here, but again, perhaps a kind of lack of self-awareness in the face of the light of reality. She doesn't quite understand herself. Oh, am I? Again, it's important. I think it's not actually phrased as a question. It's more of an exclamation. I think possibly a sense of deliberate, playful sort of self-exposure. She moves out of the yellow streak of light. I think there's a sort of self-protection here. And the inverse, actually, of that moth-like behaviour that is invoked at the beginning, that is drawn towards the thing that, in Blanche's case, actually harms her, the crude, unmitigated, the uninterfered with light of reality. Stella says with girlish laughter, you ought to see their wives. Laughingly, I can imagine big beefy things, I suppose. You know that one upstairs. More laughter. One time, the plaster cracked, so there's this really bitchy, catty attacking of women here that I think resolves itself and exposes their snobbery. And I think it's fulfilling the roles defined for them by Stanley and his friends, that they're sexually competitive. And the plaster cracking here, I think, again, gives us this sense of the sort of animalistic and primitive role that we see being developed here in the line that Stanley says, you hens cut out that conversation in there, that they're completely ostracized and dictated to, even though they are in a separate space. So again, Stanley is dominating the stage, even though he's in a completely different room. And there's no, I think, communal sort of interaction here. It's a complete sort of dictation. You can't hear us, well, you can hear me and I said, shut up. It's dictatorial. And he's got actually no idea what they're even discussing. It's simply that they're having a conversation. And he's completely dictating the space. This is my house and I'll talk as much as I want to. He knows that the material power is with him. Stella don't start a row. He's half drunk. I'll be out in a minute. She goes into the bathroom. Blanche rises and crosses leisurely to a small white radio and turns it on. And I think there's this sense of comfort and familiarity that she's displaying here that obviously is going to provoke Stanley. All right, Mitch, you in? What? Oh no, I'm out. Blanche moves back into the streak of light, so she is again back in this symbol of the harsh confrontation with reality. She raises her arms and stretches as she moves indolently back to the chair, so there's again this sense of comfort. And the rumba music comes on the radio, and I think it's meant to again give us this sense of sexuality and diversity all at once. Stanley, annoyed by this. Who turned that on in there? I did. Do you mind? Turn it off. He obviously doesn't even answer. I'll let the girls have their music. Sure, that's good. Leave it on. Sounds like Xavier Cugat. So there's this. It is literally just Stanley who's bothered by this. They're having a poker game. They're drinking beers. They should be in this kind of celebratory mood. But actually, we find that Stanley's single-minded desire for domination prevents him from being friendly here. And the contrast with the other guys is important here. That they have a sense of sort of possible pleasure, and he's completely obsessed with dominating the game and dominating the space. He jumps up and crosses to the radio, turns it off. He stops short of the sight of Blanche in the chair. There's this eagerness for domination and control, and it's what creates her sense of discomfort, and he is determined in that role. He wants to create this sense of discomfort. She returns his look without flinching, so at this moment, there is a sense of accumulating conflict, but because she's not backing down at this moment in time, then he sits at the poker table. Two of the men have started arguing hotly. So there is, again, a parallel with Stanley in a birthday party and his sitting prior to that investigation and interrogation. Steve, Pablo, and Mitch start talking again. What were you doing then? He was looking through them drapes. He recognizes here Mitch's vulnerability and his attraction, I think, to Blanche. He jumps up and jerks roughly at the curtains to close them, and this again is his control of the physical space. He seems to dominate and control the environment in the same way that Goldberg does again here. Deal that hand over again and let's play cards or quit. Some people get ants when they win, so there's this sense of it being unusual for them when someone else actually wins a game. And they're portrayed again through physicality and stage directions. In binary roles, I think Mitch rises as Stanley returns to his seat, and as soon as Stanley sits down, Mitch gets up and tries to leave, and Stanley, yelling, shouts, "Sit down!" So he's incredibly forceful and physical and direct in his orders and his directives. I'm going to the head, deal me out. Sure, he's got ants now, 7 $5 bills in his pants folded up tight as spitballs, so he's trying to deliberately undermine him and undermine his sense of generosity. Tomorrow you've seen at the cashier's window getting them changed into quarters, and when he goes home he'll deposit them one by one in a piggy bank his mother gave him for Christmas. So there's this sense of him, him kind of flouting the rules of this male conversation and gives a sense of maternal power over Mitch that emasculates him. And I think this is a contrast with Stanley's with Meg, because his adoption of a kind of sort of almost a slightly passive Oedipal role is willful, and I think makes both of them vulnerable in this sense. But here, Mitch adopts this willingly. He laughs uncomfortably because this is supposed to be kind of masculine kind of, hijinks and comedy. But he laughs uncomfortably. It's a performance of social acceptance and bonding. It's not genuine, and continues through the portiere. So he seeks refuge, like Stanley, away from the threatening, the menacing physical space of the stage. Blanche softly says, "Hello, the little boy's room is busy right now." So there's a sense of infantilization of him that when we find out all of the truth about Blanche's past, I think obviously is associated in some ways with her sexuality, but it gives her a sense of comfort. We've been drinking beer. I hate beer. It's a hot weather drink. There's this sort of class tension, I think, just in this discussion about their drinking tendencies and their drinking preferences. Blanche says, "Oh, is there an inscription on his cigarette box?" And she reads it with feigned difficulty, I think, in order to de-emphasize the difference between them and to get physically closer to him. She's trying to flirt with him here. And then she says, "And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death." And it's from my favourite sonnet by Mrs. Browning. So there's this, again, this tragic connection between this and Blanche's own life. Love thee better after death is that sense of being trapped by her past, because that's precisely the situation that she finds herself in with the boy that she fell in love with when she was 16. That's from my favourite sonnet. And then again, it gives her not only a chance to live out the past, but an identification of sensibility with in Mitch because of his choice of something aesthetic. And he says there's a story connected with that inscription. And so this is where they have this shared sense of tragedy. It sounds like a romance, pretty sad one. Mitch says the girl's dead now in a tone of deep sympathy. So here's their connection. The shared sense of tragedy, which is a contrast with, the sensibility or lack thereof in Stan Kowalski. And that there is, I think, an important moment of connection that's going to be suggested in the play here. She says, "She knew she was dying when she gave me this, a very strange girl, very sweet. She must have been fond with you. The attachments are sincere attachments." And so, here, this is an important point of contrast. Sorrow makes for sincerity, I think. It sure brings it out in people. There's a connection in this, but the irony is that the sincerity is absent from our identity, and that her sorrow hasn't made her sincere. It's made her more performative. But again, a counter-argument to that would be is that she hasn't found somebody in whom she can confide and therefore with whom she can be sincere. And I think Mitch, it suggested that Mitch could become that person. Um, the little there is belongs to people who have experienced some sorrow. So I think there's a sense of self-definition here, and that I think it it contrasts with the way that Lulu and Stanley interact here. You know, that sense of shared, an authentic connection that is on the basis of their vulnerability, and that you don't see that the flirtatious interaction with Lulu and Stanley. And Lulu goes on to show that she's actually attracted to the inverse, kind of the posture of power that Goldberg represents, because of her own Electra issues. I believe you're right about that, Mitch says. I'm positive that I am. So we have this sort of sense of mutual affirmation and directly responsive dialogue that is the stark contrast, in stark contrast to any of the connections that are evident in the interactions in Pinter's plays. Show me a person who hasn't known any sorrow and I'll show you a superficial. Listen to me, my tongue is a little thick. You boys are responsible for it. And then she says, I'm not accustomed to having more than one drink. There's a huge irony at play in this speech, because there's a lack of self-honesty here that is superficial in her performance. That she says she's not accustomed to having one more drink, and she's a kind of only semi-functioning alcoholic, and that it's that vulnerability here that these self-deceptions are designed to mask, like Stanley's piano story in A Birthday Party. She talks about her name, Dubois, and it means woods, and Blanche means white, so the two together mean white woods, like an orchard in spring. You can remember by that. And her name is important here, and her self-consciousness about her name. Obviously, an orchard in spring, again, she uses a simile to describe the meaning of her words, but that sense of rebirth and innocence that I think is used to define her and to justify her own identity, because it's ironic because it's after lies. So that sense of innocence and purity is tainted by her inauthenticity. And I think the idea of her being Dubois and wooden and made of wood, again, suggests that sense of cultivated performance, of craft, and actually her name itself then becomes this sort of self-contradiction of innocence and of deliberately performative inauthenticity. Blanche says, we're French by extraction. Our first American ancestors were French Huguenots. So there's, again, the phrase by extraction is a sense of fame, nobility. You know, that phrase itself is designed to signify her superior socioeconomic class. And Mitch says, you are Stella's sister, are you not? And he can't actually connect the two of them together because she is so performing her sense of social superiority. Blanche says, I bought this adorable little coloured paper lantern at a Chinese shop on Bourbon. Put it over the light bulb, will you please? Be glad to. I can't stand a naked light bulb any more than I can a rude remark or a vulgar action. This is a hugely important moment because the paper lantern becomes an enormous symbol of her attachment to idealized or aestheticized visions of reality and to self-deception and delusion. And that's connected here with her nobility and her idealized personal mythology, that she's connecting her she can only confront reality through a paper lantern, the paper lantern of the obsolete social norms of the Old South. Mitch adjusts the lantern. I guess we strike you as being a pretty rough bunch. He's obviously responding to this socioeconomic superiority that she's so determined to sort of signify at this moment in time. And there's a sense of discomfort in his lines. And Blanche says, I'm very adaptable to circumstances. This is completely untrue. And it's her main weakness, you know. So there's again, I think actually in this moment, a sort of direct lie. Because I think she is aware of this fault in her own personality. Blanche says, Stella hasn't been so well lately and I came down to help her for a while. She's very run down. And actually it's her own flaws, I think, here that have led her here. And this sense of dishonesty is precisely what we see all the way throughout in this performative vision of her identity. Which says, you're not married? No. I'm an old maid school teacher. You may teach school, but you're certainly not an old maid. And we know from dramatic irony that Blanche is fishing for a compliment. And again, hey presto, Mitch is the one who gives it to her. And she says, thank you, sir. I appreciate your gallantry. So this, again, um, facilitates Blanche's self-delusions in a way that invites comparison with Meg and Stanley, but perhaps invites contrast with Lulu and Stanley and her refusal to offer those contrasts, those supports for her delusion, her self-delusions. Stanley bellowing shouts Mitch, and there's again this huge sense of physical control about the way his lines are delivered, and a sense of brutality that contrasts with Mitch's comforting, I think, offering of delusion here. And here, and Blanche remarks on this, what lung power. So he's anxious even to keep Stanley away, to keep Mitch away from Blanche, because he recognises her character flaws so much and is so hostile to her. Mitch says, I bet you teach art and music. She's trying to guess what she teaches. And you might teach arithmetic. Never arithmetic, sir. Never arithmetic, with a laugh. And this is her only objection to all of that speculation. I think it's connected to that sense of brutal physical reality that's preferred over aestheticism. And that's the only thing that she objects to. I don't even know my multiplication table, she says. And so I think, the concrete reality over aestheticization is the tension here, and I think invites again Stanley's comparison with Stanley's piano story. She laughs. And later on, I attempt to instill a bunch of Bobby Soxers and drugstore Romeos with reverence for Hawthorne and Whitman and Poe, and a huge sense of class superiority and aesthetic superiority is evident in this. She's, Mitch falls for this sense of superiority and aesthetic superiority, hook, line, and sinker. Blanche says, I guess that most of them are more interested in other things and how right you are. The literary heritage is not what most of them treasure above all else, but they're sweet things. And in the spring, it's touching to notice them making their first discovery of love as if nobody had ever known it before. And there's a massive sense of irony here that she actually facilitates their first discoveries of love, as we find out later on in the play. She's involved in their losses of innocence, and that's what's brought her here, is her sexual involvement with minors. She says, the bathroom door opens, Stella comes out, Blanche continues talking to Mitch. Well, have you finished? Wait, I'll turn on the radio. She turns the knobs on the radio and it begins to play. Vienne, no du en ligne. Blanche waltzes to the music with romantic gestures. So there's this sense of, I think, of romance that's being invoked by the music itself and her behaviour. Mitch is delighted and moves in awkward imitation like a dancing bear. Of course, he similarly presents it as being primitive. But again, it's an imaginary world of shared vulnerability that they're invoking here, and that I think invites comparison with Stanley's concoction of delusive reality, or delusory reality, in the boarding house itself. Stanley stalks fiercely through the portiere here, and again, this little fantasy world that they've constructed, Stanley comes in and dominates it, stalking fiercely. He's constantly described like an aggressive predator. And this power is easy, with his power, it's easy to violate the kind of fragile boundaries between Blanche and him on the stage. He snatches it off the table and with a shouted oath tosses the instrument out the window. So there's again, for some, there's a huge signification in someone that's as materialistic as him and someone that's as proud of his consumer goods, throwing this out the window, and shows that he's only really concerned with power over others like Goldberg and McCann. He's just bothered about domination, and that he violates this little imaginary space that they construct for each other. Stella says, drunk, animal thing. So she's drawn into this kind of socioeconomic snobbery and this vilification of the men through the animalisation of them. She rushes through to the poker table. All of you, please go home if any of you have one spark of decency in you. Stella, watch out, Blanche is wild here, and there's something important in all of these different linguistic choices here. Blanche is wild and Stanley charges after Stella. So this language here is so provocative, I think, to Stanley, because decency is one of those lexical choices that invokes that sense of noble manners in the South. But the wild behaviour of Blanche and the charging after Stella animalizes both Blanche and Stanley at this time as being, perhaps acting in a way that's determined by animalistic desires and impulses rather than human rationality. And that again invites a comparison between the savage brutality of Goldberg and McCann at times in the interrogation scene. The men feebly in resistance to Stanley, telling him to take it easy, fella, that's all. And Stella just says, you lay your hands on me, and she backs out of sight. He advances and disappears, and there is the sound of a blow. So there is this violent force that we don't actually see on the stage, and Stella cries out. And I think that violent force, in some ways, is comparable to Goldberg and McCann's violent destruction of Stanley's glasses, but I think that moment in A Birthday Party is much more comparable to the Blanche's rape in the final parts of the play. Stella cries out, Blanche screams and runs into the kitchen. The men rush forward and there is grappling and cursing. Something is overturned with a crash. So this contrast between the safety of the idealized world with Mitch and the sheer violence and physicality of reality, I think, is shown through, again, the stagecraft, the set and the stage directions here, where the space that the men are occupying is one of violence and conflict, and it's Blanche that has to keep herself away from that in the kitchen, and it's not a coincidence that's where she's safe, in that space that we associate with these kind of misogynistic domination of femininity. There's lunacy. Stanley is pinioned by two women. Again, it's meant to suggest the idea that he has wings, and again portrays him through this lens of sort of animal imagery, I think. And he nearly throws them off, so there's this sort of sense of supreme strength and primitive, unconscious behaviour that goes on in his stage directions. Then all at once he subsides and is limp in their grasp, so there's this sudden reversal here that questions his control. And I think, again, questions his mental control over this, that he's acting in an animalistic or primitive way that's beyond the operation of his rationality. They speak quietly and lovingly to him, and he leans his face on one of their shoulders. And again, there's this sense of camaraderie. It's partly because he's drunk, and it naturally captures this sort of typical sort of oscillation between violent hysteria and sentimentality that you see in drunk people sometimes. Stella says in a high, unnatural voice, out of sight, I want to go away, I want to go away. So here, I think it does humanise Stanley, but at this moment in time, there's this sense of disruption and unfamiliarity in what Stella says. She just wants to get out of here. She's unhappy with this new reality that her life in New Orleans and Stanley represents. And Mitch just simply says poker shouldn't be played in a house with women, that in the end ultimately blames them for the raw competition that's been created with the men. And that their raw reality is, their vision is competing with a reality that they can't tolerate. And that, again, blaming women, I think, for the social discord that occurs here. Blanche says, I want my sister's clothes, we'll go to that woman's upstairs. There's an irony in this moment of sort of female solidarity, that they're actually looking for refuge with the person that they were actually being hostile towards earlier, when they were busy trying to impress men and being catty towards her. Blanche says, Stella, precious. Dear little sister, don't be afraid. With her arms around Stella, Blanche guides her to the outside door and upstairs, and then establishes this huge sense of conflict between Stella and Blanche and Stanley over Stella and the control of her, and obviously the sense of social values and ideology that conflict represents. Stanley says, Dolly, what's the matter? What's happened? And here I think there's actually a loss of consciousness that suggests the behaviour is sort of beyond his own control, and that there's actually powerful sort of deterministic, fatalistic forces that are driving this conflict between him and Blanche. And Mitch has put him under the shower. And this is again ironic, as this absolution is the same as Blanche, and perhaps draws attention to their lack of consciousness of their flaws. That the fact that they both use this motif of bathing and cleansing that's constantly throughout the play. Stanley says, let go of me, you sons of bitches, and sounds a blow there. They're fighting with each other, and that physical brutality is again revealed in private when the men are in close proximity with each other. But it's part of their friendship here. But Steve says, let's get out of it quick, and they rush to the poker table and sweep up their winnings on their way out. And Mitch, sadly but firmly, poker should not be played in a house with women. And it becomes kind of chorus-like in its function, reflecting on the competing visions of reality that is exemplified, that are exemplified here. This sense of rugged, brutalistic reality and the supposedly delicate sensibilities of the women. The door closes on them and the place is still. The Negro entertainers in the bar around the corner play Paper Doll, Slow and Blue. This is about the fragility of someone in a passive role that the women find themselves in here. After a moment, Stanley comes out of the bathroom, dripping water and still in his clinging, wet polka dot drawers. And I think there is a very deliberate connection between Stanley and that Vasuviana polka that we hear in terms of music. The song itself is Polish in origin, as is Stanley, and his boxer shorts here not only highlight his kind of rugged masculinity, but they also draw attention to his connection to the song itself and the associations of self-destruction that they bring with Blanche. And Stanley says, "Stella, my baby doll's left me," and he breaks into sobs. And so there is a huge intensity of feeling and a moment of vulnerability here, but it's based on control and domination. And I think it produces Blanche as an enemy, this desire for domination. But it's animalistic, this is what we see here, that this desire is based on this kind of primitive, compelling sense of fatalism that is, we're talking about a very brutal, animalistic vision of human sexuality and human romance. There's an indistinguishable shrill voice heard, and he hurls the phone to the floor. So there's a sense of distance in this, the fact that the voice is indistinguishable. He knows that it means that she's far away and hurls the phone to the floor. There's a dissonant brass and piano plays, but of course also what it could mean, Eunice just shouting at him, telling him to go away, and he violently hurls the phone to the floor. The brass and piano sounds of the room dims out to darkness, and the outer walls appear in the night light. The blue piano plays for a brief difference. So this mise en scène here, I think, again, is about the penetration of external reality and the disturbance of the internal world that Stanley and Stella have established, and the penetration of reality in their relationship, and Blanche represent that, but also that external sense of reality on Blanche. He throws back his head. He's out on the porch, half dressed, and down the wooden steps, and this is the kind of the image on the cover of the book, and he throws his head like a baying hound, and again it's deliberately animalized and intense and authentic, but not based on human morality and not based on the rational control of behavior. And it's this famous line where he yells, "Stella!" There's a loss of control and a sense of being undermined that's motivating this desire for this sort of animalistic kind of howling for his mate, and it's very deliberately represented in these sexual terms. Eunice confronts him and says, "You can't beat a woman and then call her back. She won't come, and you're going to have a baby, you stinker, you whelp of a Polack, you. I hope they do haul you in and turn the fire hose on you, same as last time." It's Stanley's underdog status, and that I think the cyclical nature of his violence, that there's a sense of force beyond his control that has determined that he has done this before. And this is absolutely not meant to excuse him from a male perspective of this behaviour that men are depicted as being completely primitive at this moment of time. And whelp again, he turned into an animal, and a Polack, and his sense of economic and ethnic inferiority motivates this. Stanley humbly attempts to sort of placate Eunice and says, "I want my girl to come down with me," and she slams the door. And then from that sudden moment, with heaven-splitting violence, "Stella!" And this is the famous moment in the play that we see in response on the cover here. That moment where he's in this position here is immediately after this. We'll see in a second. But the heaven-splitting violence again gives us the sense that his behaviour is being determined in some way by forces beyond his control. The lone-tone clarinet moans, and again the music is offering that sense of coherence between the sound and the subjective state of the characters that is sort of functioning like a tragic chorus, I think, commenting on the action. Stella slips down the rickety stairs in her robe. They're both vulnerable at this moment in time physically, and there's again that sense of being compelled to each other by the street unnamed desire, their physical desire for each other. There's enough to overcome all of these other weaknesses in their relationship. Her eyes are glistening with tear and her hair loose about her throat and shoulders, and she's deliberately portrayed in this kind of wild fashion. As a sufferer of violence, but also compelled by desire that she cannot help. And you see this, they stare at each other, that this attraction is completely beyond conscious control in them. And they come together with low animal moans, and he falls on his knees on the steps and presses his face to her belly, curving with a little with maternity. So again, they're being compelled here by the sense of physical desire that is beyond their control, and adopts this subservient body language, which is really important here, I think, as a way of trying to placate her. Her eyes go blind with tenderness, so the feeling itself, this powerful sense of desire, drives a loss of comprehension and vision, so she actually can't see. So Stanley here at a birthday party is in danger by this compromised vision, but it's also almost willfully experienced here. Her eyes go blind with tenderness. She can't help but feel powerfully towards Stanley, in spite of his violent and hostile treatment of her. He snatches the screen door and lifts her off her feet and bears her into the dark flat as if she's being disappeared and abducted by this kind of predatory animal. So there's this enormous, again, display of physical power in this. And the entrance and exits are key here, because as he disappears with her like some predatory animal, Blanche comes out on the upper landing in her robe and slips fearfully down the steps. So there's this sense of Blanche's alienation here from the couple, and an order that she can't understand or command. She can't deal with this powerful this powerful desire that compels these two people together. And she says, "Where's my little sister?" And that's completely at odds with that sort of animalistic attraction and sexuality that's seen in the above stage directions. She stops before the dark entrance of her sister's flat and then catches her breath as if stuck. So here, she's, her consciousness, she is impeding this, is impeding her breathing. She rushes down to the walk before the house. She looks right and left as if for sanctuary. But she's absolutely lost here in the consciousness of order and her sense of alienation. She's struck, catches her breath as if struck. And she's completely alienated from this order that is represented by their relationship and the status quo that she has in some way disrupted. The music fades away and Mitch appears around the corner. So the fact that she's looking right and left as if for sanctuary, and then Mitch appears, tells us that is exactly the role that he's going to play in the play. He represents the sanctuary and the possibility of evading reality with a fellow sufferer or someone else that's unadaptable to the brutality of this type of reality that we see here, and they have this conversation. Blanche says down here that she's terrified, and Mitch has adapted to this slightly more. They're crazy about each other, and there's an unusual logic here. They are crazy about each other, but there's a craziness involved in all this violence that should preclude them from being together in some way. But then also there's a mad, powerful force beyond their control compelling them together. And Blanche just says, "I'm not used to such," and she can't think of a word to articulate it. This is an experience beyond her linguistic register, and that inarticulacy connects her, I think, to many of the characters in Pinter's plays, that this is an experience beyond her comprehension. She has no idea how to relate to it. It's a shame that this had to happen when you just got it, but don't take it serious. But the action itself is serious and is actual violence, but it reveals the carnal nature of their attraction. That Mitch has seen them do this and reconcile before. It shows us the power of their physical connection, their sexual connection. She says, "I'm not properly dressed. That don't make much difference in the courtroom." There's that point of adaptation there that she feels vulnerable. But no one really cares at this particular moment in time. And Blanche goes back to the silver case. That she's resuming this escape from reality. And Mitch says, "I showed you the inscription." And Blanche says, "Yes." During the pause, she looks up at the sky. And the sky is constantly evoked here as this refuge from all of this conflict. And it invites comparison with Desire Under the Elms, because that is used very clearly as a symbol for perhaps the ego itself, or the ability of Aben or Ephraim Cabot to in some way reconcile the competing Apollonian and Dionysian impulses that are driving the interactions of the characters in that play. And this is what Blanche is invoking here. There's so much confusion in the world. Cough differently, thank you for being so kind. I need kindness now. This confusion in the world is the incompatibility of her vision of life with the values of reality, and the sky is this sort of place of escape. Again, it's a mental refuge from this conflict. And she needs kindness now. She says she's always depended on the kindness of strangers in some of her final lines in the play. But there is a sense of self-absorption here, that she's just seen, witnessed her own sister experiencing domestic violence, and that her whole value system is under threat here. And so the fact that it's also based on chivalry as well is revealed in these particular lines.